The screams of the saloon patrons fell silent as Nancy Miller was dragged up onto the makeshift wooden platform. The year was 1878, and Silver Creek, Colorado, was a town ruled by men who saw women as commodities rather than people. Nancy's wrists were bound with rough rope that bit into her skin, her honey-blonde hair falling in tangled waves around her dirt-smudged face. 6 months of working as a maid at the Silver Dollar Hotel had earned her nothing but debt, accusations of theft, and now this a public auction to pay off what she owed. "Gentlemen," called out Bartholomew Jenkins, the hotel owner, his voice carrying across the dusty town square. "As you know, this girl has been working to pay off her passage from Boston. Unfortunately, she's been stealing from paying customers and causing nothing but trouble. I'm selling off her remaining contract to recover my losses." Nancy's blue eyes flashed with anger. "That's a lie," she shouted, struggling against her bonds. "I never stole anything. You're the thief. You promised fair wages and never paid me a cent." A sharp slap across her face silenced her protests. Blood trickled from her split lip as she glared defiantly at Jenkins, refusing to let the tears gathering in her eyes fall. "Let's start the bidding at $20, Jenkins announced, ignoring her accusation. "She's got 2 years of service left on her contract." The crowd of miners, ranch hands, and drifters began calling out numbers, their eyes roving over Nancy like she was livestock. 25, 30, $40 from a leering miner with tobacco-stained teeth. 50 from Mr. Walton, called Jenkins, pointing to the owner of the local brothel. Nancy's blood ran cold. She knew what kind of work would be expected of her there. 75, shouted another voice, belonging to a gray-haired rancher who had tried to corner her in the hotel hallway just last week. $100. The new voice cut through the clamor like a knife. The crowd parted, revealing a tall figure at the back. Nancy squinted against the setting sun to make out the stranger. He stood at least 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, with a dark Stetson pulled low over his eyes. A long duster coat hung from his shoulders, and the silver star pinned to his vest caught the fading sunlight. "Well now," Jenkins said, his greedy eyes lighting up at the highest bid so far. "We have 100 from the gentleman in the back." 200, said the stranger, stepping forward. His spurs jangled with each deliberate step. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Even Walton, the brothel owner, stepped back, unwilling to challenge the newcomer. 200 going once, Jenkins called out, barely containing his excitement. Going twice. Sold. To the cowboy with the badge. The stranger mounted the steps to the platform, and Nancy finally got a clear look at him. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his late 20s, with a strong jaw darkened by stubble and eyes the color of a summer storm. His gaze met hers briefly before he turned to Jenkins. "I'll take her contract," he said, his voice deep and steady. He pulled a leather pouch from his coat and counted out the money. Jenkins snatched the bills eagerly. "She's all yours, Marshal. Though I warn you, she's got a mouth on her." The man, a marshal, apparently didn't respond. Instead, he drew a knife from his belt, causing Nancy to flinch. But he only used it to cut her bonds. "Can you walk, miss?" he asked quietly. Nancy rubbed her chafed wrists, eyeing him warily. "Yes." "Then come with me." He offered his arm, but she ignored it, stepping down from the platform on her own, head held high despite the humiliation burning in her chest. The crowd dispersed, disappointed by the anticlimactic end to the spectacle. The marshal led her across the street toward a small building with sheriff's office painted on the door. "I'm not going to be your servant," Nancy said once they were away from the crowd, "or anything else for that matter." The marshal glanced down at her, the hint of a smile touching his lips. "I didn't expect you would be Mississippi?" "Miller," Nancy Miller. Miss Miller. He nodded. I'm Marshal Nathan Blackwood, and I have no intention of enforcing that so-called contract. He pushed open the door to the sheriff's office and gestured for her to enter. Inside was a simple room with a desk, a gun rack, and 3 cells at the back. A pot-bellied stove in the corner radiated warmth. Sit down, he said, indicating a chair. You're free to go wherever you please, but I thought you might want to clean up first and have something to eat. Nancy remained standing, suspicion written across her face. Why did you buy my contract if you're just going to let me go? Marshal Blackwood hung his hat on a peg by the door. His dark hair was slightly damp with sweat from the hat, and a scar ran along his right temple. Because what Jenkins was doing was illegal, even if this town pretends otherwise. He moved to a small basin of water in the corner and dampened a clean handkerchief. Here, for your lip. Nancy hesitantly took the cloth and pressed it to her split lip, wincing at the sting. Thank you, she said softly, some of her wariness fading. But I still don't understand. $200 is a lot of money. The marshal shrugged. It's not my money. It's the town's money, recovered from Jenkins himself for tax evasion. Seemed fitting to use it this way. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young boy stuck his head in, holding a tray covered with a cloth. Brought the food you asked for, Marshal, the boy said, his curious gaze sliding to Nancy. Thanks, Tommy. Blackwood took the tray and placed it on the desk, giving the boy a coin. After the door closed, he uncovered the tray to reveal a plate of steaming beef stew, fresh bread, and a mug of coffee. Eat, he said. Then we can talk about what you want to do next. Nancy's stomach growled at the sight of the food. She hadn't had a proper meal in days. Cautiously, she sat down and picked up the spoon. What options do I have? She asked between bites of the rich stew. I came west because my parents died, and there was nothing left for me in Boston. I had hoped to earn enough to buy a small piece of land someday. Blackwood leaned against the desk, watching her. You could leave Silver Creek, take the morning stage to Denver, or... He hesitated. Or what? Nancy prompted. Or you could marry me. Nancy choked on her stew. I beg your pardon? The marshal had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. It's not as sudden as it sounds. I've seen you around town these past months. Noticed how hard you work. How you help that old widow Simmons even though you barely have enough for yourself. Nancy stared at him, dumbfounded. You want to marry a woman you just purchased at auction? A woman you barely know? I'm not proposing out of charity, Miss Miller, he said firmly. And I'm not purchasing you. I'm offering you a choice, something Jenkins never did. He ran a hand through his hair. Look, I won't pretend it's a love match, but I have a house that needs tending, and you need protection in a town that just tried to sell you to the highest bidder. A convenient arrangement, Nancy said coldly, putting down her spoon. A practical one, he corrected. You'd have your own room. I wouldn't expect anything from you that you weren't willing to give. And after a suitable time, if you wanted to leave, I'd give you enough money to start over somewhere else. Nancy studied him, searching for signs of deception. His eyes met hers steadily, without the lustful gleam she'd grown accustomed to seeing in men's faces. Why would you do this for me? The marshal was quiet for a moment. My sister was in a similar situation once. No one helped her. Something dark and pained crossed his features. I couldn't save her. Maybe I can help you instead. The rawness in his voice struck Nancy. For the first time since being dragged onto that auction platform, she felt something other than fear and anger. She felt understood. I'll consider it, she said finally. But I need time to think. Blackwood nodded. Fair enough. You can stay in the cell tonight. The cell? Nancy interrupted, alarmed. It's the safest place in town for you right now. I'll leave it unlocked, of course. I'll sleep at my desk." He smiled slightly. "Jenkins and his friends might come looking for you once they've had enough whiskey. This way, I can protect you." Nancy glanced at the small but clean cell with its cot and blanket. It was certainly better than returning to the hotel. "One night," she agreed. "And tomorrow I'll give you my answer." Marshal Blackwood nodded. One night, as darkness fell over Silver Creek, Nancy lay on the cot in the cell, listening to the muted sounds of the town piano music from the saloon, occasional shouts, the distant whistle of a train. Through the small window, she could see stars scattered across the black sky, so much brighter than they'd ever been in Boston. She thought about Nathan Blackwood's offer. Marriage to a stranger seemed like trading one form of servitude for another. And yet, there had been kindness in his eyes, and his proposal, odd as it was, had been presented as a choice rather than a command. What other options did she have? The stage to Denver would take her last few coins, and then what? Another position as a maid, another employer like Jenkins? A commotion outside the office jolted her from her thoughts. Raised voices. Then the door burst open. Marshal Blackwood rose from his desk, hand moving to his holster. Jenkins stumbled in, followed by 3 men Nancy recognized as regular patrons of the Silver Dollar Hotel. All were visibly drunk. "There she is," Jenkins slurred, pointing at Nancy. "You had no right to interfere, Marshal. I had a legal contract with that girl." "There was nothing legal about it," Blackwood replied calmly. "You brought Miss Miller here under false pretenses and then tried to sell her to cover your gambling debts." Jenkins' face reddened. "She signed the papers. She agreed to work off her passage. She agreed to work for fair wages, which you never paid," the marshal countered. "Now I suggest you gentlemen leave before I arrest the lot of you for disturbing the peace." One of the men, a burly miner named Haggerty, stepped forward. "You can't arrest all of us, Blackwood." "I can certainly try." The marshal's voice hardened. "For drunks against one sober lawman with a loaded gun. Those aren't good odds, gentlemen." For a tense moment, Nancy thought violence would erupt. Her hands gripped the iron bars of the cell. Then Jenkins spat on the floor. "This ain't over," he growled. "That girl is trouble, and you'll see it soon enough." After they left, slamming the door behind them, Marshal Blackwood let out a long breath and returned to his desk. "Are you all right?" Nancy asked softly. He glanced up, seeming almost surprised by her concern. "I'm fine. This isn't the first time I've dealt with Jenkins and his cronies." "Will they come back?" "Not tonight. They'll drink themselves into a stupor first." He picked up a worn book from his desk. "Try to get some sleep, Miss Miller. Morning will be here before you know it." Nancy lay back down but found sleep elusive. She watched as the marshal read by lamplight, occasionally making notes in a small journal. There was something reassuring about his steady presence, the measured way he turned the pages, the quiet authority he carried without needing to assert it loudly like so many men in Silver Creek. By dawn, she had made her decision. "I'll marry you," Nancy said over breakfast, which consisted of strong coffee and biscuits the marshal had procured from the cafe across the street. Blackwood looked up from his coffee, surprised. "You're certain?" "No," she admitted candidly. "But it seems the best of limited options. However, I have conditions." The hint of a smile touched his lips. "I'm listening. First, this is a partnership, not ownership. I won't be treated as property or a servant." He nodded. "Agreed. Second, I want to learn to shoot. If I'm going to live in this town, I need to be able to protect myself." This request seemed to surprise him, but he nodded again. "Fair enough. Third," Nancy continued, gathering her courage, "if after 6 months either of us is unhappy with the arrangement, we part ways amicably." You provide me with enough money for passage elsewhere, as you offered. Agreed. Anything else? Nancy hesitated, then said softly, I want a real wedding, not just signing papers at Judge Wilson's office. I want to stand before a preacher and have at least the appearance of a proper marriage. Blackwood studied her for a long moment. May I ask why that's important to you? Nancy looked down at her coffee. Because I want people to see me as your wife, not as the girl you bought at auction. I want some dignity, Marshal Blackwood. Nathan, he corrected gently. If we're to be married, you should use my given name. Nathan, she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. We can be married by Reverend Hayes this afternoon if that suits you, he said. But you'll need a dress and I should find a ring. Nancy smoothed her wrinkled, dirty dress self-consciously. I don't have anything else to wear. Mrs. Evans at the general store might help with that, Nathan suggested. She's been trying to marry me off to her niece for years. She'll probably be relieved I'm finally settling down, even if it's not with her choice of bride. Despite herself, Nancy smiled. And what will you tell people? About why you're suddenly marrying a woman you supposedly just met? Nathan considered this. The truth, more or less. That I couldn't stand by and watch an innocent woman be mistreated. That I offered marriage as protection. He met her eyes. That you're a good woman who deserves better than what Silver Creek has given you so far. Nancy felt a flutter in her chest that she quickly suppressed. This was a practical arrangement, nothing more. She couldn't afford to confuse gratitude with deeper feelings. Then I suppose we should make preparations, she said, rising from her chair. I'll go see Mrs. Evans about a dress. By midday, news of the Marshal's impending marriage had spread through Silver Creek like wildfire. Nancy found herself the subject of curious stares and whispered conversations as Mrs. Evans fitted her with a simple but elegant blue dress that had been ordered by a mine owner's daughter, who then eloped with a traveling salesman. It's just gathering dust in the back, Mrs. Evans said, adjusting the waist. And it brings out your eyes beautifully. The Marshal won't know what hit him. Nancy didn't correct the woman's assumption that this was a love match. Let them think what they wanted, it was better than the truth. At 4 o'clock, Nancy stood in the small white church at the edge of town. Wildflowers gathered by the Reverend's wife adorned the altar, and sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the wooden floor. Only a handful of people were present. Mrs. Evans and her husband, Deputy Collins, who worked with Nathan, the Reverend and his wife, and surprisingly, old Widow Simmons, whom Nancy had helped with errands whenever she could. When Nathan entered, Nancy's breath caught. Gone was the dusty duster coat and trail-worn clothes. He wore a clean black suit with a silver brocade vest, his dark hair slicked back neatly. He'd shaved, revealing a strong jawline previously hidden by stubble. The only familiar element was the Marshal's badge still pinned to his vest. He approached slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. When he reached her side, he whispered, "You look beautiful, Nancy." "You clean up nicely yourself, Marshal," she replied, trying to mask her nervousness with humor. The ceremony was brief but traditional. Nathan had somehow procured a simple gold band that fit her finger perfectly. When Reverend Hayes pronounced them husband and wife and told Nathan he could kiss his bride, Nancy tensed. Nathan seemed to sense her unease. He leaned forward and pressed his lips gently to her cheek instead of her mouth, his hand lightly touching her waist. The gesture was respectful but still gave the appearance of affection to their small audience. "Thank you," she whispered as they turned to face the congregation. "Mrs. Blackwood," he replied with a nod, offering his arm. The name sounded foreign to her ears. Mrs. Blackwood. No longer Nancy Miller, the orphaned girl from Boston who had fallen on hard times. Now she was the Marshal's wife, a position that commanded respect in a frontier town like Silver Creek. They walked down the short aisle together, stepping out into the late afternoon sunshine as husband and wife. A small reception followed at the town's only restaurant, where the owner, an Italian immigrant named Angelo, had prepared a special dinner in honor of the Marshal's wedding. Nancy found herself seated at the head table beside Nathan, accepting congratulations from people who had ignored her existence when she was merely a hotel maid. "How are you holding up?" Nathan asked quietly during a lull in the festivities. "I'm fine," Nancy replied, though her cheeks hurt from smiling politely at people she barely knew. "Just tired. We can leave soon," he promised. "I know this must be overwhelming." As the evening wore on, Nancy observed her new husband interacting with the townspeople. He was respected, even liked, but there was a distance. He maintained a reservation that kept people from getting too close. She wondered what experiences had taught him to guard himself so carefully. Finally, as the sun began to set, Nathan stood and thanked everyone for coming. He offered Nancy his arm once more, and they departed amid good wishes and knowing winks that made Nancy's cheeks burn. The walk to Nathan's house took them through the quieter residential area of Silver Creek, away from the saloons and businesses. The house itself was modest but well-built, a one-story structure with a small front porch and neat yard. "It's not much," Nathan said as he unlocked the door, "but it's solid. No leaks when it rains, and the stove works well enough." Nancy stepped inside, taking in her new home. A sitting room with a stone fireplace opened into a small kitchen. A short hallway presumably led to the bedrooms. The furniture was simple but of good quality: a sofa, 2 armchairs, a dining table with 4 chairs. "It's lovely," she said honestly. After 6 months in a cramped attic room at the hotel, this house seemed like a palace. Nathan showed her to a bedroom at the end of the hall. "This will be your room," he said, lighting a lamp. "Mine is across the hall. The washroom is between us. I had Mrs. Simmons come by earlier to make up the bed with fresh linens." The bedroom was simply furnished with a bed, a wardrobe, a small writing desk, and a rocking chair by the window. A colorful quilt covered the bed, and curtains matching the quilt framed the window. "I don't know what you like," Nathan said, sounding almost apologetic, "but we can change things. Get different furniture if you prefer." Nancy turned to him, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the past 2 days. Yesterday morning, she had been a virtual prisoner at the hotel. Today she was standing in her own bedroom in a house she now shared with a virtual stranger who was legally her husband. "It's perfect," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Thank you." Nathan regarded her carefully. "You've had a long day. I'll let you rest." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Nancy, I meant what I said. This is your home now. You're safe here." After he left, Nancy sat on the edge of the bed, running her hands over the soft quilt. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry, not from sadness or fear, but from the relief of finally having solid ground beneath her feet. The following weeks established a routine of sorts. Nathan rose early each morning for his duties as marshal, returning home for lunch when he could. Nancy took charge of the house, cleaning and cooking and making small improvements that transformed the bachelor residence into a home. They were cautious around each other, unfailingly polite, like dancers learning steps to an unfamiliar tune. Nathan kept his promise to teach Nancy to shoot, taking her to a clearing outside town where they wouldn't attract attention. "Relax your shoulders," he instructed, standing behind her as she aimed at a row of bottles he'd set up on a fallen log. "Don't anticipate the recoil or you'll miss." Nancy tried to focus, but she was acutely aware of his presence, the slight pressure of his hands adjusting her stance, the warmth of his breath near her ear. She squeezed the trigger and the shot went wild. "I'm terrible at this," she sighed after another miss. "You're just beginning," Nathan said patiently. No one becomes a marksman in a day. He demonstrated again, his movements fluid and confident as he hit 3 bottles in rapid succession. "How long have you been a marshal?" Nancy asked as they reloaded. 5 years officially. Before that, I rode with the Texas Rangers for a while." He handed her the pistol. "Try again." This time, Nancy hit one of the bottles, sending glass shards flying. She turned to Nathan with a triumphant smile, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, a current of something unnamed passing between them. "Good shot," he said finally, breaking the spell. "Let's try again." In town, Nancy gradually made her place as the marshal's wife. She helped Widow Simmons with her garden, assisted Mrs. Evans with organizing a fundraiser for a new schoolhouse, and even started teaching reading to several children whose parents couldn't afford the tuition at the town's small school. Not everyone welcomed her new status. Jenkins still glared whenever their paths crossed, and some of the women who had set their caps for the handsome marshal were cool toward her. But overall, life in Silver Creek as Mrs. Blackwood was vastly different from her existence as Nancy Miller. One evening, about a month after their wedding, Nancy was preparing dinner when Nathan returned home earlier than usual, his expression troubled. "Is everything all right?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "There's been trouble at the Morrison Ranch," he said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "Cattle rustlers hit them last night. I need to ride out there at first light with a posse." Nancy felt a chill of apprehension. "Is it dangerous?" "Could be," he admitted. "These aren't ordinary rustlers. They shot 2 of Morrison's hands." He met her eyes. "I might be gone a few days." Nancy nodded, turning back to the stove to hide her concern. "I'll pack provisions for you." During dinner, Nathan was quieter than usual, his thoughts clearly on the task ahead. Nancy found herself studying him the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the strong lines of his face, the hands that could be both gentle and lethal. "Nathan," she said suddenly, "why did you really marry me?" He looked up, surprised by the question. "I told you why. You said your sister was in trouble once, and no one helped her." Nancy set down her fork. "What happened to her?" Nathan was silent for so long that Nancy thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed, pushing his plate away. "Her name was Rebecca. She was 19 when she left home to work as a governess for a wealthy family in Austin. The father." His jaw tightened. "He took advantage of her position. When she became pregnant, they threw her out without references or pay." Nancy's heart ached for the young woman and for the brother who clearly still carried the pain of her story. "She wrote to me for help, but I was tracking outlaws in the Panhandle. By the time I got her letter and made it to Austin, she had already." He swallowed hard. "She died trying to get rid of the baby herself. Alone in a rented room not much bigger than a closet." "I'm so sorry," Nancy whispered, reaching across the table to touch his hand. Nathan looked down at their joined hands. "When I saw Jenkins dragging you up onto that platform, all I could think was that I couldn't fail another young woman the way I failed Rebecca." "You didn't fail her," Nancy said firmly. "The man who took advantage of her did. The family that cast her out did." Nathan's fingers curled around hers. "Maybe, but I should have been there. I should have protected her." His eyes, when they met Nancy's, held a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "I couldn't save Rebecca, but I could help you." In that moment, Nancy understood that their marriage, practical as it had seemed, was rooted in something deeper for Nathan, a need for redemption, a chance to right a wrong he couldn't change. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "And thank you for helping me when no one else would." They sat in silence for a while, hands still joined across the table, the connection between them shifting into something new and undefined. Later, as Nancy prepared Nathan's saddlebags for the journey, She found herself fighting back tears at the thought of him riding into danger. It was foolish, she told herself. They had an arrangement, not a love match. Yet the idea of losing him made her chest tighten painfully. Before dawn the next morning, Nancy rose to make Nathan breakfast before his departure. She found him already dressed, checking his guns at the kitchen table. "You didn't have to get up," he said when he saw her. "I wanted to," she replied, setting coffee on to boil. "You shouldn't ride out on an empty stomach." They ate in companionable silence as the first hints of daylight appeared through the window. When it was time for him to leave, Nancy walked him to the door. "Be careful," she said, adjusting his bandana. "I will." He hesitated, then bent down and kissed her cheek, his lips lingering longer than they had at their wedding. "Lock the doors while I'm gone. And remember what I taught you about the gun. It's in the top drawer of my desk if you need it." Nancy nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She watched from the porch as he mounted his horse and rode to meet the posse gathering at the edge of town. Just before he disappeared from view, he turned in the saddle and raised his hand in farewell. 3 days passed with no word from Nathan or the posse. Nancy kept herself busy, but worry was her constant companion. She jumped at every sound, hoping it was Nathan returning, and slept poorly, her dreams filled with faceless dangers. On the 4th day, a hard rain began to fall, turning the streets of Silver Creek to mud. Nancy was returning from delivering a basket of food to Widow Simmons when she noticed unusual activity at the doctor's office. Several horses were tied outside, and men were gathered on the porch, speaking in low voices. Her heart racing, Nancy approached, recognizing one of the men as Bill Henderson, a rancher who had ridden out with the posse. "Mr. Henderson," she called, hurrying through the rain. "Have they returned? Is my husband with you?" Henderson turned, his weathered face grave. "Mrs. Blackwood." "Yes, we just got back." "And Nathan? Is he all right?" Her voice rose with panic at Henderson's expression. "He's inside with Doc Turner. We ran into the rustlers yesterday at Crow Canyon. There was a shootout. The marshal took a bullet." Nancy pushed past him into the doctor's office, her sodden skirts heavy around her ankles. The small waiting room was crowded with men. Some injured themselves, others just muddying the floor with their boots. She scanned the room frantically. "Mrs. Blackwood." Doc Turner emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on a towel. "I was just about to send someone for you. Where is he? How badly is he hurt?" The words tumbled out. "He's resting. Bullet caught him in the shoulder. He lost a fair amount of blood, but he's young and strong. With proper care, he should recover fully." Relief made Nancy's knees weak. "Can I see him?" The doctor nodded, leading her to a small examination room where Nathan lay on a narrow bed, his shoulder heavily bandaged, his face pale but his eyes open. "Nancy," he said, his voice rough with pain but tinged with relief. "You're here." She rushed to his side, taking his uninjured hand in hers. "Of course I'm here. Did you think I wouldn't come?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Wasn't sure you'd hear about it so quickly. Town gossip has its benefits, I suppose. Can I take him home?" Nancy asked the doctor. Doc Turner nodded. "He needs rest and the wound needs regular cleaning. But yes, he'll be more comfortable at home. I'll send over some laudanum for the pain." With help from Henderson and another man, Nathan was transported to their house in a wagon. By the time they had him settled in his bed, his face was ashen with pain and exertion. "Thank you," Nancy told the men as they prepared to leave, "for bringing him back." "He saved Tyler's life," Henderson said, nodding toward the other man. "Pushed him out of the way and took the bullet himself. The marshal's a good man, Mrs. Blackwood." After they left, Nancy set about making Nathan comfortable, preparing broth and tea, changing his bandage as Doc Turner had shown her, and administering the laudanum when the pain became too intense. Through the night, she sat by his bedside, applying cool cloths to his forehead when fever set in, speaking softly to him when he grew restless. By morning, the fever had broken, and Nathan slept more peacefully. Nancy dozed in the chair beside his bed, waking when she felt his fingers brush her hand. "You stayed all night," he said, his voice stronger than it had been the day before. "Of course I did." She poured him water from the pitcher on the nightstand. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been kicked by a mule, but better than yesterday." He studied her face. "You look exhausted. You should rest." "I'm fine." She helped him sit up enough to drink. "Are you hungry? I can make more broth." "Nancy." His hand caught hers. "Thank you for taking care of me." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. His gray eyes were clear and intent on her face. "It's what anyone would do," she said, suddenly flustered by his gaze. "No, it isn't." His thumb stroked the back of her hand. "When I was lying there in the canyon, bleeding and thinking I might not make it back, all I could think about was you. About how I hadn't told you." "Told me what?" she asked when he trailed off. Nathan's eyes held hers. "That our arrangement has become something more to me. That I don't want it to be just a practical marriage anymore." Nancy's heart beat faster. "What do you want it to be?" "Real," he said simply. "I want it to be real, Nancy." She looked down at their joined hands, emotions warring within her. "I've been afraid to admit it even to myself," she confessed. "But I felt the same way. When they told me you were shot, I thought my heart would stop." Nathan tugged gently on her hand, drawing her closer until she was perched on the edge of his bed. "I think I've been falling in love with you since the first day, when you stood on that platform with your chin up, defying the whole town. I think I started falling for you when you cut my bonds and asked if I could walk," Nancy replied, a smile trembling on her lips. "You were the first person in Silver Creek who treated me like a human being, not a possession." Nathan's hand came up to cup her cheek. "May I kiss my wife properly now?" In answer, Nancy leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened, months of unacknowledged feelings pouring into it. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "I should have done that a long time ago," Nathan murmured, his eyes warm with affection. "We have time to make up for it," Nancy replied, resting her forehead against his. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur as Nathan recovered from his wound. Their relationship transformed, no longer marked by careful politeness but by growing intimacy. They talked late into the night, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Nancy moved her belongings into Nathan's larger bedroom, and for the first time, they truly lived as husband and wife. By the time Nathan was strong enough to return to his duties, Silver Creek was buzzing with news that the Marshal and his bride were clearly besotted with each other. The story of their unusual courtship, the auction, the impromptu proposal, the marriage of convenience that blossomed into love became a favorite tale, embellished with each retelling. 6 months after their wedding, long past the deadline Nancy had set for reevaluating their arrangement, they celebrated with a small dinner party for the friends they'd made in town. As Widow Simmons, Mrs. Evans, Doc Turner, and Deputy Collins raised their glasses in a toast, Nathan leaned close to Nancy. "Happy?" he asked softly. Nancy smiled, thinking of how far they'd come from that dusty afternoon when she stood bound on an auction platform. "More than I ever thought possible." Later that night, as they lay in bed with moonlight spilling through the window, Nathan traced patterns on Nancy's bare shoulder. "I've been thinking," he said. "What would you say to building a bigger house? This one's getting a bit cramped with all your books and my gear." Nancy propped herself up on one elbow. Are you planning to acquire more gear, Marshal Blackwood? No. His eyes held a mixture of hope and vulnerability. But I was thinking we might need more room eventually. For a family. Nancy's breath caught. A family? Nathan nodded, suddenly looking uncertain. Unless you don't want, Nancy silenced him with a kiss. I want that more than anything, she whispered against his lips. A family with you. His smile was like sunrise breaking across his face. I love you, Nancy Blackwood. And I love you, Nathan Blackwood. She settled back against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. More than I have words to say. 1 year to the day after Nancy was dragged onto that auction platform, she stood in the doorway of their new home, watching as Nathan placed the final shingle on the roof. The house was larger than their first, with 3 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a covered porch that wrapped around the front. What do you think? Nathan called down, wiping sweat from his brow. It's perfect, Nancy replied, one hand resting on the slight swell of her belly, still hidden beneath her dress. She hadn't told him yet about the baby. She was waiting for the house to be finished, wanting to make it a special moment. That evening, as they sat on their new porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Nancy took Nathan's hand and placed it on her stomach. I have a housewarming gift for you, she said softly, but you'll have to wait about 6 more months to properly receive it. Nathan's eyes widened as understanding dawned. Nancy, are you saying? She nodded, her eyes shining with happy tears. We're going to have a baby. With a whoop of joy, Nathan lifted her from her chair and spun her around, his laughter mingling with hers in the evening air. Setting her gently back on her feet, he knelt before her, his hands cradling her stomach with reverence. Hello, little one, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm your pa, and I promise I'll always protect you and your ma, for all the days of my life. Nancy ran her fingers through his hair, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. From an orphaned maid sold at auction to a beloved wife and soon-to-be mother, her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. Thank you for saving me, she whispered. Nathan rose to his feet, gathering her in his arms. We saved each other, he corrected, pressing his lips to her forehead. And that's the greatest gift of all. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Nancy and Nathan Blackwood stood together on the porch of the home they had built, their hearts full of love for each other and for the child who would join their family in the months to come, living proof that even in the wild and unforgiving West, love could blossom in the most unexpected circumstances, turning a desperate bargain into a blessed life. 5 years later, the Blackwood family gathered around their dinner table, Nathan at one end, Nancy at the other, and between them their son James, now 4, and their daughter Rebecca, named for Nathan's sister, who had just celebrated her 2nd birthday. Pa! Tell the story again, James pleaded as Nancy served apple pie for dessert. About how you rescued Ma from the bad men. Nathan's eyes met Nancy's across the table, sharing a private smile. The story had become a family legend, though they'd sanitized it considerably for the children's ears. Well, son, Nathan began, pulling James onto his lap. Your ma was the bravest, prettiest woman in all of Silver Creek, but some mean fellows were treating her poorly. So I stepped in and asked her to marry me right then and there. And Ma said yes because you were so handsome, Rebecca chimed in, repeating the line she'd heard many times. Nancy laughed, shaking her head. I said yes because your father was kind and good, she corrected, reaching across to wipe a smudge of pie from her daughter's cheek. The handsome part was just a fortunate bonus. And then you falled in love, James said with the certainty of a child who believes all stories should have happy endings. That's right, Nathan confirmed. I fell in love with your mother, and she was gracious enough to love me back. And then you had us, Rebecca added triumphantly. The best part of the whole story, Nancy agreed, her heart full as she looked at the family that had seemed an impossible dream not so long ago. Later, after the children were tucked into bed and the house had grown quiet, Nancy joined Nathan on the porch swing. The evening was cool, and she nestled against him as he wrapped a blanket around them both. James asked me an interesting question while I was putting him to bed, Nathan said, his arm around her shoulders. Oh, what was that? He wanted to know if we were in love when we got married. Nathan's fingers played with a strand of her honey blonde hair, now streaked with touches of silver. I wasn't sure what to tell him. Nancy considered this. What did you say? I told him that love isn't always like it is in storybooks. Sometimes it grows slowly, like a tree from a seed. He pressed a kiss to her temple. But that doesn't make it any less strong or true when it's fully grown. That was a good answer, Nancy murmured, snuggling closer. Was I right, though? Nathan asked, a hint of vulnerability in his voice even after all these years. Were there seeds of love there from the beginning? Nancy tilted her face up to his. I think there must have been. Otherwise, how could it have grown so strong? The lines around Nathan's eyes crinkled as he smiled. Mrs. Blackwood, you have a way with words. I learned from reading all those books you keep buying me, she teased. Our shelves are overflowing. We'll build more shelves. He kissed her softly. I'll build you anything you want, Nancy. Always have, always will. As the stars emerged in the velvet sky above Silver Creek, Nancy Blackwood closed her eyes and said a silent prayer of gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought her to this moment, for the auction that should have been her downfall, but instead led her to the man who became her salvation, her partner, her love. The journey hadn't been easy, but as she often told her children, the most precious things in life rarely came without struggle. And Nathan Blackwood, the stoic marshal who had opened his heart and home to a desperate young woman, only to discover his own redemption in the process, he was the most precious gift of all.